before I attempt to enter into the text again, are there any questions based on the assignment? Yeah.
You had started to speak around love and Paul Tillich last time. And
Yes, right.
And I was just wondering if that thought is still relevant. I don't remember what it was. I don't remember.
Well, the point I was making, what got it diverted was I made an analogy to what Tillich says about love and the legal principle of equity. That was the analogy. To go back to Tillich's notion was, in some deeper sense, that one can only do justice to the person, true justice, full justice, complete justice, existential justice, you might say, to the person by means of love. Right? So love is the attitude toward the person which, now this is my metaphor, not Tillich's, I don't believe, that fits them like a glove, right? That fits the situation. And I think the connection, I don't remember what provoked it in the conversation or the text, although we could probably research it and find out. But in general, the connection would be to the notion, the thinking now occurring of this notion of a kind of the absolute differentiation / particularization of existence, or the notion of the person as absolute particular, as essentially now intelligible as never before in some sense. And so Tillich's notion of love, as I remembered it, would be relevant here. And I think I actually used in today's assignment somewhere the word love. And without getting diverted too much to begin with, but...
the next page, actually, page 18.
Okay. Okay. I do... Okay. I don't want to look at that yet because I want to go back to some of the earlier pages, but I think it's relevant to say as a general principle here that the reference to Tillich is not accidental. The use of the term love in the process of a critique of Marx is important, and it's not entirely, as in a certain sense, nothing is, except the essence of this, entirely unprecedented, entirely unprepared for in dealing with the assault of the incarnation. Modern thought is not entirely unprepared for this assault, and one place in which, quite specifically, this not being entirely unprepared appears, which I think I made reference to last spring in some context or other, is, for example, in Emerson's rather what appear at one level to be very naive statements, political statements about the fact that why hasn't it ever occurred to anybody that the state should be founded not on the principle of force, which it has been ever since the Romans, but on the principle of love. All right? Now, I say, in one sense, that seems like a very naive thing for Emerson to say, but he was dead serious. Right? So that naivete is, if you credit it with some seriousness, the naivety turns into a kind of deeply radical notion that, if we use Emerson as a touchstone, is importantly there in American pragmatism. And you see it on another level in Peirce, who is specifically a pragmatist, not only in his cosmology, which is a process of evolutionary love, right? That's basically the driving force and the constitution of evolution for Peirce, but also Peirce's, to the extent to which Peirce had any political notions, he understood civilization to be a civilization I don't even think he used the word Western, but human civilization at that point in history, he understood certainly Western civilization was a civilization founded on the principle of love. So whereas Emerson is more concretely talking in his writings about the state, although it has a reference to a larger human potentiality in Emerson, so more specifically, Peirce sees the whole civilization as founded in the principle of love. And as he points out, whether any of the members of the civilization are aware of it or not, it is nevertheless still the case. Since we're still, believe it or not, in a preliminary mode here in terms of open to questions, again, by way of preliminary statement, I want to go back to something the little Adam said. One of the questions that he posed, he made note of the fact last time I had inserted some sort of new paragraph into the text and that wasn't in the text and so forth and so on. And I don't remember exactly what I said verbatim, but I was talking about somehow or other the responsibility of the individual or the person. And it stuck in my ear all week that in acknowledging whatever I said to him by way of response to that critique, he, or maybe in even formulating the objection that he raised, he used the word he said to the effect that it seemed to him that I had brought in, as opposed to the ontological understanding of the person that we've been talking about all along, I had brought in a kind of moral or ethical dimension, right? And the reason it's stuck is because it's clarification of that issue is fundamental to clarifying something that's going on in this text that we're reading last week and tonight. And the clarification would be that can be very misleading. I mean, for openness, the way I would put it is that what is being said when I speak of the responsibility of the person being unprecedented, it's not being said in a way that assumes tacitly or implicitly that there is still operative a distinction between ontology and morality or ethics. And again, part of the answer to Charlemagne's question here is to say that the overcoming of the distinction between
Excellence.
But let me just stick to the same terms between, let's say, ontology or being and what ought to be, right, is already in some form or another accomplished in Hegel, and to the extent to which that overcoming of that dichotomy is accomplished in Hegel, ideally, formally, if you want, you see, it's paradoxical to say, but if you can imagine Marxism as a kind of, Chuck is going to fault me now for being too simplistic, but a kind of collectivistic existentialism, Marx is trying to existentialize this the Hegelian overcoming of the distinction between is and ought, right? So he's trying to, and therefore he's trying to unveil the true state of affairs, the way it is, do you see, and to show that the way it appears to be is not the way it is, and the reason it isn't the way it is because the way it appears to be is not the way it ought to be, you see. So Marx, in a sense, buys lock, stock, and barrel Hegel's claim to have overcome the dichotomy between what I would call ontology and morality, let's say, a dichotomy which he saw continuing, he saw not yet overcome in Kant, right? In other words, Kant had paralleled, go back to the substance and appearance, the substantial phenomenon and the apparent phenomenon, the noumena and the phenomenon. That dichotomy in Kant was never unified. That's Hegel's basic objection to Kant. And what is that dichotomy in Kant? On another level, another way of putting that, what is morality or reason to be associated with in Kant as over against the brute isness of the natural world, right? It's freedom, right? So for Kant, there is human freedom, right? And then there is the world of natural necessity, right? To see the unity of those is Hegel's fundamental project, to see that intellectually, to demonstrate in effect, the inadequacy of Kant's relatively abstract, see, from a Hegelian point of view, dualism of freedom and necessity. So the thinking now occurring can be positioned, and it is done in today's text, even though it isn't perhaps done as explicitly as I'm starting to do now, which I want to do more carefully when we get further into the text. But the thinking now occurring is being understood in the context of that development from Kant through Hegel to Marx, and therefore the points of contact that I acknowledge that exist between the thinking now occurring and Marxism, or Marx's understanding of things, are very real, and the fundamental objection to Marx is that he does not get beyond self-consciousness, but it's the same kind of objection that the thinking now occurring might have to Kierkegaard. It's not a complete dismissal by any stretch of the imagination, right? What's holding Kierkegaard back is that he concedes too much to Hegel. What's holding Marx back, so to speak, is that he is too much himself a Hegelian, in a way analogous, at least, to the way in which Kierkegaard is irreducibly a Hegelian in opposition. Okay, let's stop that a moment. And there was another question, preliminary questions?
I hope we get to it today.
Okay.
On page 21,
all right,
near the bottom, about 10 lines up, you were talking about the absolute mediator in the sentence.
Yes,
the sentence,
right.
But now, in fact, real existing things are actually intelligible. That is, actual individual things are intelligible qua historical, which is to say that now the absolute is the absolute mediator. I'd
Okay.
love to hear you parse
okay,
that out.
all right. Well, that's part and parcel of what I want to do, so I think we're going to do it one way or the other. Any other preliminary questions? Okay. Just to back up into last time's assignment a little bit, I think I alluded to it. I don't think we did it textually. So looking at, just take a look at Marx's text as quoted on page 11 toward the bottom of the page, about 7 or 8 lines up. All round dependence, this natural form of the world historical cooperation of individuals, will be transformed. Now, just to slow the film down, you see how Marx, he starts with the individuals, right? When he looks at this world historical thing, he's got this notion that world historical cooperation is one of individuals explicitly. It will be transformed by this communist revolution into the control and conscious mastery of these powers, which, born of the action of men on one another, have till now overawed and governed men as powers completely alien to them. Now, this view can be expressed again in speculative idealistic, and now he puts in this dig, right? And again, in this sense, I think it's probably not normal to think of Marx as an existentialist, but he is as existentialist in this regard as Kierkegaard is. He's like, if they were sitting down over a cup of coffee, on this point, they'd be in perfect agreement, right? This idealistic Hegelian view is fantastic from Marx's point of view, but it's analogously fantastic, you see, from Kierkegaard's point of view. Terms as self-regeneration of the species, society as the subject, and thereby the consecutive series of interrelated individuals connected with each other. All right, now just slow the film down there again. This is a positive statement by Marx, right? For Marx, these individuals who are the elements of the world historical process that we are now undergoing, right, are conceived by Marx as a series of individuals interconnected with one another. Right, that's what I'm calling the existential reality for Marx, the non-fantastic real-world reality. But idealism, Hegel, right, has inverted the whole thing, and he has turned this series of interrelated individuals connected with each other really connected by real-world connections from Marx's point of view, he has turned that into the conception of a single individual. Right? So this is his critique of Hegel, which accomplishes the mystery of generating itself. Right? So the self-generation of the single individual, Marx probably wouldn't even deign to use the term here, right? But the divine individual generating itself in history, the world spirit in Hegelian terms, generating itself in history is the ultimate truth from a Hegelian perspective, you see, of what for Marx is quite simply and unadornedly this world historical interconnected series of individuals become, in a Hegelian fantastic way, they become merely the manifestation of a single individual. Right? That's where Marx is coming from there. It is clear that individuals certainly make one another physically and mentally, but do not make themselves. Right? So he's attacking at one and the same time the abstract notion of a single individual, which ultimately in Hegel is the divine individual manifesting itself in the human individuals that exist world historically. And by the way, in Marx, of course, rather in Hegel, another difference is that because Hegel starts from the top down, so to speak, right? It starts with a single individual manifesting itself, the world spirit, in history, in world historical individuals. Starting from the top down, Hegel understands that between the series of interconnected individuals who become the associated producers in a Marxist materialistic economic view of human being, right? Between them, those associated producers, and the divine being in a Hegelian universe, among other things, most centrally, you're going to have, most importantly, the state. All right? So the prime world historical individual for Hegel is, well, yes, in one sense it's Napoleon, to say, but in another sense it's France, right? And in a certain sense, or the French state, even more concretely, will be the principal level of individuality in world history, and then the citizens of the state are the smaller additions, so to speak, of that world historical individuality that is properly the world historical individuality of the state, and that in turn is the manifestation of the divine individual, the world spirit. All right. So, taking just a brief positioning here of the thinking now occurring in the context of this particular critique of Hegel by Marx, the basic notion here of matter, the body itself, would be that in some sense, to be parsed out in the book, okay, but in some important sense, there is something like the single individual, the divine individual in Hegel, but it takes on the understanding of it in the thinking now occurring is that it is itself matter, right, or it is itself material, and it is therefore that single individual becomes the body. So there is another way of putting it is that there is a single body, and if I put it in theological terms, it is the body of Christ. You see, it is the Word made flesh. In the context, I think you could say that it's what makes possible, what makes at least provisionally intelligible this understanding that's being articulated in the thinking now occurring. What makes it provisionally understandable is, in fact, the development of modern scientific notions, the tendency of which, the thrust of which, is to break down the common sense notion of divisions between the parts of nature, right? So maybe the quantum mechanical idea that the particle can be in two places at once would be a kind of an extreme carrying out of that notion, right? What would be the expression in quantum mechanical terms? It's a kind of
non-locality.
right, exactly. The principle of non-locality. Okay, so if you take the quantum mechanical principle of non-locality as a kind of index of what I'm talking about in the drive of modern consciousness, which paradoxically may be connected with the what I would take to be the modern use of the notion of totality, but without going off on that at the moment, if you take that, then to the extent to which science has come, modern science has come in its own way to a principle of non-locality, to that extent, you see, that analogy that I was using last term about the Eucharist in the tabernacle, the medieval doctrine, all right, is that Eucharist, which is the body and blood of Christ, which is the incarnate, resurrected Christ, but the real body and blood, you see, there in where localized, right? Even though universal, but universalized too. See, it's kind of an interesting anticipation, right? Because the same body and blood is in every church in Brooklyn, and also in Rome and in Paris and in Africa and it's all around the world, but it's still somehow locally so, right? There are spaces in between the churches where it isn't. You see, so to the extent to which what is being said here is that the Eucharist is existence itself, right? The formal preparation for that. The formal preparation for the intelligibility of such a notion is already there in the tendency of modern science. Now, of course, modern science is indebted, which I make, I think, more explicitly clear in Faith and Philosophy. Modern science is explicitly indebted itself for the notion of totality, to the extent to which it's connected, I think. I mean, this is off the top of my head. I just think that like that non-locality idea is like the notion of totality turned inside out. It's like you ever try and turn an orange peel inside out? You know, it's a kind of fun experience.
Do you know David Bohm?
Yeah.
David Bohm is. There are any number of different cosmological.
Yeah, I mean, it rings a bell, but yeah.
He calls it his term for the totality of material existence, as it were, in the context of non-locality, is the holo movement. HOLO.
Okay.
Movement. So it has this sense of its own activity, but it's totalized in the sense of every part, every local event is implicated in what he calls the implicate order, which is the underlying universe in which the statistical distribution of these events are actually all connected.
Okay.
So,
Right.
But the point is that I would just sort of, as a little warning here, is that this is all unfinished business. It isn't like science says any of this. What science says is pretty, it's uninterpreted. And so then you've got lots of interpretations. Some of them go that way. Some of them are drier, and so it's just. It seems to me, I always feel it's a bad bet to lay anything too heavily on what science says at this date, because it's going to be different in 20 years. You know it, whatever it is.
Correct. But I detect here a slight. There's a slight difference here in our understanding of science. It came up first last term when we were talking about Aristotle at some point, and I was saying Aristotle has a hypothesis, and you were saying, but it's not a scientific in the modern sense of the word, right? And there's a deeper sense, and so my authority here would be Peirce, right? In other words, I would say that science, truly understood, is precisely interpretation. I'm saying not from the thinking now occurring. I'm saying from a Peircean perspective, science is at every level interpretation of
Right, but
reality.
then you just have the problem of the multiplicity of interpretations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. But I covered that by being prescient enough to say the tendency,
Yeah.
the general tendency of modern science is toward this notion of, which is exemplified in non-locality. That's all.
But it's just that non-locality is really up for grabs. And,
Okay.
And everybody is doing everything they want with it.
Okay.
So.
All right. All right. But I'm happy that it's up there for grabs.
Yeah.
I'm a
Grab,
grabber.
you're grabbing.
I'm a grabber. Okay. Another. Okay. Now I want to see if I can find the. Well, we're going to have to say that.
Before you get off
yeah.
page 12,
Okay.
when Marx says, I don't know, a dozen lines up or so,
Up from the bottom.
yeah,
Okay.
communism is only possible,
After the dots, empirically,
Yes.
communism is only possible.
yeah.
Of the
After it presupposes the universal development of productive forces.
Mhm.
Now, these are forces which Marx himself agrees are not the fruit of communism. Is that right?
correct. I mean,
So
I think,
so
in other words, the
I think
highest.
It's put that
The highest development of capitalism
Capitalism
is the
is communism.
prerequisite for the communist revolution.
Yes, yes. Now, I was wondering, since one of the surprises to me in reading all this is how much attention Marx paid to the philosophers of the day, if you will.
Mhm.
And he was a philosopher. Yeah,
Well, he wouldn't be happy with that idea, but right.
yeah.
He was a recovering philosopher.
Okay. And I don't know the dates of Kierkegaard.
They're roughly
Well,
contemporary.
roughly. And so when Kierkegaard said receptivity is productivity,
Right.
was that in any way? Did Marx have that connotation of productivity in mind in any deep sense or shallow sense?
Well, I don't recall a specific passage to that effect, but I would say I think you could legitimately understand his critique of capitalism to be in that direction, because he understands what the communist revolution will do away with is the notion of a surplus labor, and in effect, therefore, turn the control of the forces of production over to the producers, but in their capacity as consumers, as those who are really only producing what they need for their own lives to consume. Plus, he allows for a reserve for a rainy day. Okay, but so in that sense, I think
With the state determining whether it's raining.
no. Ultimately, the state is a
Wither away.
yeah, it's a necessary evil.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the answer to the question, short answer, I think is yes. I think it's there in Marx. I don't know that it's there in quite those terms, but I think that is a.
There's no way that Marx would have been reading Kierkegaard, right? Because there weren't translations into German.
Yeah.
Right?
No, not that I know of.
Danish.
Yeah, not that I know of.
Yeah.
Well, that's all.
Okay.
But it wouldn't be necessary, though, under the thinking now occurring.
What? What would not?
Well, no doubt there's thinking now occurring in Mandarin that you're not aware of.
Yeah, but I'm not
Come
sure
out
the point.
later.
I'm not
It'll
sure.
come out later. In
Well,
this-
no. Well, it depends. Everything depends on what is meant by the statement. The thing now occurring is committed to the notion that thought and consciousness is essentially historical. the full realization of the essentially historical nature of consciousness is the thinking now occurring. But to the extent to which the realization of which it is the form, then it's whatever may be going on unknowns to us has to be connected in some way. I don't like the term. It has to be related to the history of thought. So
That means Western thought.
well, yes, Western thought, as it turns out, but Western thought is deeply rooted in the East. So there's a history there too. Hegel makes this point in a more narrow. Well, I guess he makes this point in general in his history of philosophy, but he makes it in a rather detailed way in his lectures on the philosophy of religion, where he is very explicitly analyzing the what in effect is the history of God consciousness, the history of religious consciousness, and he starts in Chinese religion and so forth, and he literally works his way from east to west. So he would understand a deep continuity between East and West historically, and that seems to me to be the most explicit form in which he presents that. But I think it's implicit in his thinking, and I see nothing in the thinking now occurring that would deny that. But Western in the sense that where the world has come historically is to the dominance. Western civilization has brought this history to a certain level, and it is the penultimate stage of what is now the incipient world civilization, right? I think one of the problems we have politically, the Bush administration being an extreme example of this, right, is it's very tough for American civilization to adjust to how successful it has been in creating a world that transcends it. To say it's like giving birth, not wanting to let go of the children, right? So Western civilization has been the penultimate instrument of, if I put this in Hegelian terms, of the divine spirit of world history, the penultimate instrument, but not the ultimate actor, not the ultimate individual in Hegelian terms. The ultimate individual is now, in Hegelian terms, is now forming itself. Now, of course, it goes beyond Hegel. Hegel would not have anticipated a absolute solidification, as it were, of a single world historical individual known as a world state or a world community. That's something that
not.
Yeah, right. But what I'm saying is, but in his terms.
Yes. But also in Marxian terms, I mean, is the idea of the culmination of capitalism, that this was going to involve simply Europe and America. It turns out like the moment of communism hasn't gotten there yet. Globalization has to finish.
Right.
If globalization finished, then you get to see whether what Marx says is true.
Right. If that's if you don't understand the text, you have to wait. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now, another point of contact, since we're on that little topic, on page 14 in his text, at the top of page 14, he says in the third line toward the end, whilst the communist revolution is directed against the preceding mode of activity, does away with labor, and abolishes the rule of all classes with the classes themselves, because it is carried through by the class which no longer counts as a class in society. What I want to focus on there is his use of the mode of activity, right? There's a certain way, of economic activity that is done away with in Marxist analysis, right? Or in the communist revolution, might be a better way of putting it. And it's at least analogous to what is being said in the Thinking Now Occurring in the preface, that the Thinking Now Occurring is a new way, right? So it's not doing away with thinking, right, in any simple sense, but it is analogous to Marx's critique of capitalism. Capitalism, like modern science in Leahy's rendition, for Marx, capitalism is driving in the right direction, right? It's driving toward a productivity for its own sake, right? But it's limited right? It is, in my language, it would be self-restricted from a Marxist point of view. And the participants, by the way, in that self-restriction are the proletariat themselves. In other words, notice he says someplace, yeah, right there. Oh, good. In that same quote, at the end of that quote, this revolution is necessary, about 5 or 6 lines up, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, okay? That's not the whole of it. But also because the class overthrowing the laboring, the propertyless proletariat class, the class overthrowing it can only in a revolution succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of ages and become fitted to found society anew. So in other words, the revolution is transforming the mode of activity in the deepest sense of the word, so much so that it does away with labor, I would say labor as a class, and therefore does away with that class consciousness, paradoxically, if you want, or ironically, of the revolutionary, and is therefore transformative of those who are conducting the revolution, transformative of those persons, and only in that act do they become fitted to found society anew. So in that sense. And in that sense, he is very philosophical revolutionary. I mean, he's got a deep, well, the term fits easily. He's got a deeply real idea here, right? And maybe that's it. A deeply materialistic idealism, or deeply idealistic materialism, but in no superficial sense. Yeah.
I know Marx spent a lot of time in London writing stuff at the British Museum and so on. Did he write this in English? Is this
No, this is a translation.
Okay. It's obviously a British translation.
Yes.
Can I try to paraphrase something where you were before that? I think,
Okay.
About this kind of macroanthropos, the big.
Okay.
Right. Okay. So you could sort of say that in the religions, less obviously so in Christianity, but certainly obviously so in Hinduism and in certain aspects of Judaism and in all kinds of tribal religions, where you have this term macroanthropos, a big being that somehow is distributed among the humans and is connected in some way with the state, because in, say, Babylonia, or Egypt, where the king is the incarnation of the Baal, of the sun god, at that moment. But you always have this idea of this. Okay, so that becomes rationalized, as it were, in Hegel, where it's a universal reason that is that universal man that's distributed. And in Marx, it is inverted, or it's claimed that this whole thing was inverted, that this macroanthropos was really a generalization or a collectivization of the individual. And you are deepening the materiality of Marx's insight and finding the universal, as it were, from below. You're finding that universal context of a totality of human, but now not imposed from above, and not continuous with these top-down ideologies or theologies, but discovering that through your pyramid of incarnation, that if the Logos is penetrated all the way to that matter itself, then Marx's observation can be completely encompassed without actually the abandonment of that totalized general humanity.
Right. I think that's right, and that's part of what I want to get to in more detail. But to jump ahead a little bit, but it has to do with this kind of a notion of a kind of absolute materialization, and I think a couple of times, but fundamentally in tonight's assignment, I'm speaking of Marx's in essentially rational matter, or in essentially absolute matter or his incomplete
Is incomplete
rationalization.
Yes, the systematicity is all Hegel, even though he
Right.
turns it upside down and
Right.
has got
Right.
much more.
So if you imagine the thinking now occurring in some sense as the completion,
Yeah.
but it's a completion which requires some kind of, I'll put it in Kierkegaardian terms, some kind of leap. I mean, Marx. Let's put it this way: Marx would have to leap
Yeah.
from where he's at in order to wind up in the thinking now occurring. That's a leap which he's not about to make.
He's actually
Right.
standing off the cliff and he's got to leap back onto the.
Well, however, well, okay.
So how then does that relate to what the question, you responded to Adam's question about
Right.
faith being the form and to which reason is fitting now? How does that, if Marx was to leap, then that seems to be explicitly what you're talking about, right? If he was,
The thing that comes to mind, I like to follow what comes to mind.
Okay.
I don't want to think too much about this. I don't want to think too much about it.
Feel about it.
I don't want to I don't want to either feel about it or think about it. That is actually explicitly covered in tonight's assignment. But I don't mind feeling it or thinking it, which I'm trying to. The faith would be precisely this, as it were, the medium, the absolute mediator,
okay.
all right, in which occurs the absolute differentiation of the world's historical individuals, to say, so that they I don't know whether this is correct, but they exist with one another. I know coexist has certain connotations. They coexist. They exist with each with the other, right? Absolutely. And absolutely then in terms of Chuck's recapitulation, without any declination from some hierarchical principle, right? So the faith part of it would be I want to say, again, this is follow my instinct here, as it were, the perfectly transparent medium in which this universe of perfectly particular persons exist together with one another.
Just a clarification. That term, world historical individual, two questions. One,
Well, I'm using it, I think.
you're distributing it.
Yeah, but I'm borrowing it from.
Hegel's term means like Napoleon.
Right, and Marx uses it too, I
But
think.
Marx does use it for like,
in a practical
for
sense.
himself.
That the real concrete individuals who have not been abstracted from in the Hegelian sense, they are existing in a
world historical individual.
we're in a world historical period. Yes, Marx is
rather than the guy who acts in the name of history, like Napoleon.
right. That's right.
Yeah.
So, but Marx has already, if you want, pedestrianized the idea.
Yeah, okay,
That's right. Yeah, and I'm saying fine. We have a kind of absolute pedestrianization of reality. Something like that.
One question there about
Yeah.
you were using medium and mediator interchangeably. It seems.
Yes.
And that is confusing.
Okay.
Me.
Now, did we?
What?
Did I? I don't want to go past it. What page was it? Oh, it's in tonight. We didn't get
just
to
what-
it.
The next assignment.
Okay.
It is,
Yeah.
but that's what in
Well,
the
you got a question?
paragraph that you just said. You used them interchangeably.
Yes.
Yes. So medium and mediator. Because you use the word mediacy in relation to a critique of Marx, though, because there is this that the absolute is used as a mediating factor, right? It's something that's still used in a practical sense.
I say that, and then I think I say when I say that the absolute mediator is used, but not absolute qua mediator, not absolutely so.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. So I want to say in the thinking now occurring, what we understand is there is an absolute mediator
But in essence, there's no
Existing-
mediator, seemingly. That's
existing absolutely.
Isn't the mediator gone, though? That's what confuses me.
How about fully? Is somebody locked out? Excuse me. Oh, you got it? Oh, hey, listen. It's locking the door. Isn't the mediator gone? That's a very good question. That raises another tough question here, and that's the question of the nothing, which is not going to go away, so we can't dodge it exactly. All right. So in one sense, the mediator is gone. There is no mediator. Where was a mediator, there is nothing. But, as it were, in place of the vanished mediator, I'm starting to think of Hegel here, in place of the vanished mediator, there is nothing but existence itself, right? Or in terms of the persons, in place of the vanished mediator, right, is the infinite totality of existing individuals.
This is like your correction in the idea of the removal of the schema.
Yes, it's profoundly related to
all
that.
the schema.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Does that help?
Very much.
Okay.
Over on the top of page 15, you talk about the real transcendence of the thing. The difference itself, being itself, is comprehended as the absolutely unconditioned fact itself, qua transcendental identity, transcendent. To the extent that there is a mediator, it's the fact itself. Is that right?
Well, it's the the mediator would be the absolutely unconditioned fact itself.
Transcendent.
Yeah. Well, qua transcendental identity, transcendent. And I would add, to be more precise in that formulation, now existing. Or I might even want to say existing as the now. Because the most real, I think the basic assumption of the thinker doing the thinking now occurring is that there is nothing more real than this totally intangible, ungraspable now. Right? So the now is the irreducibly real, okay? And the irreducibly real now is always and everywhere a beginning.
This paragraph starts out with the question, Charleman's question, whether the difference between fact and reflection or appearance and essence can by the same be overcome. I mean, let's just shorten that to say whether difference can be overcome by saying. That's another way of putting this. You can prescind from fact and reflection or appearance and essence. You can add a whole laundry list of differences to that, all right? But if you could just simplify that question, which is what you're struggling with here.
Well, yeah, but your simplification changes his question, because in his question, there are 4 elements, and even if we reduce it to 2 elements, as soon as you have more than one element, you have the question of the difference between these 2 things, right? So, if you reduce it to difference...
Why don't you bear with me for a second? I'm just saying that there are differences between various concepts, fact and reflection, appearance and essence. You could make a long list of other twosomes as to which there are differences between them.
Okay.
All right? And I'm saying that if you simplify this question, say, by saying so, is any difference overcome? And then if we go to page 15, we say that it's the absolute objectivity lies in the real transcendence of the thing, which is comprehended as the unconditioned fact itself, transcendent. I mean, it is to the extent that we could pin down what you're trying to say here. Is that a useful thing? Is that a useful answer to the general question about whether differences can be overcome by saying that they're transcendent?
Well, I want to make sure. I'm not sure I understand your question.
Yeah.
What is the it in the last formulation of your question?
Whether difference is generalizable in the sense that you have these four things, and throughout the text you refer to the difference without calling back those four,
right.
And so it feels like you're talking about also all the other instances of dualisms which the thinking now occurring claims are transcendent. So
yes.
what Jim is asking, whether the whole thing is in fact the question of whether all those differences or difference itself can be overcome by the same.
Yeah, in fact,
is that the question?
Chuck, it says. Yes, that's my question. In fact, it says right here, Chuck, on page 50, the difference itself.
Yeah.
Right.
You just used that's exactly what it referred to. Not these particular differences, but difference itself.
Okay. You want to focus on difference itself, and now
I'm just trying to understand.
It says here the difference itself.
Is it that because this is here in this text, right here, it's said, if you will.
Difference itself. I get the answer. Difference itself is transcendent.
And that's the answer that you say it.
No, whether or not it's transcended by the saying is what in fact is being discussed.
That's right.
Right? Whether or in what sense the transcendence is a saying, since the issue is the further descent of the logos.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, I don't know. The original question is the difference between this and that, to simplify the original question, is it overcome by the saying?
Yeah.
That's the original question.
This and that generically.
And the possible answers immediately without explication are, no, it's not overcome by the saying, or it's overcome by other than the saying.
Right.
All right. The basic answer to the basic question is that the difference, before now, the difference between this and that, in one form or another, before now, has already been overcome.
Essentially.
But in essentially so. Correct. One of the major example of the way in which the difference between this and that before now has been overcome is Marxism. Marxist thought, right, is the main example here, through the lens of which we're also making some comments on Hegel and Kant and so forth. So before now, the difference between this and that has already been overcome historically, Marx being the example under examination. In the thinking now occurring, it is not simply a question of overcoming the difference between this and that, but doing so in a way that has not hitherto been done, that is doing so essentially. To overcome the difference between, essentially, is difference itself transcendent. Equals difference itself transcendent.
So the difference overcome in the thinking before now was merely by the saying so? That's what's inessential. That's on the inessential side. What's the saying? What's the force of the saying so? Because it brings to mind Carnapian cavils about every imagined kind of idealization, in which he shows that every screwed up idealism involves a false demonstration that something is so because it's possible to say it. Carnap has a whole view on that. So the whole positivism is really to tear apart everybody's thought, where there looks like that's what's going on.
Right.
So it seems like you're raising that issue in some sense here, and giving some kind of a different answer to it, obviously. But
I think that's correct. That is, if I focus in on the question about the role of the saying,
yes,
right here, then I want to say, to the extent to which it is true that difference itself is transcendent, the difference between the saying and the reality
has been transcended.
has been transcended. that the word is
Green is green, like we always thought.
the reality. Now, again, to show the potential intelligibility of this, I go back to our friend
You
Peirce.
underline potential, right?
Yes, right.
Yeah, okay.
I'm perfectly willing.
It doesn't have to be intelligible.
Well, I say potential. I
Be
mean
felt.
for the reader. Right.
Right.
I go back to Peirce, for whom everything is a sign. Man is a sign. Do you see? So the thinking now occurring has been prepared for in a number of ways, not essentially, but formally has been prepared for. And in Peirce, I have to take with utter seriousness the well, I guess you could say the inseparability of the real and the sign, right? Speaking broadly.
Sort of a cosine.
Now, there are very few grounds for actually expelling somebody from a class. That raises the issue.
I think that's pretty good, actually.
I mean, disagreement is one thing, but I mean, really, puns like that are. However, I'm going home and think about it.
Don't drive off the road. You'll find stuff deep.
Well, I'll tell you. I mean, nothing is a tangent.
Sometimes in talking about ranges and domains, you talk about a codomain.
All right. All right, but not to get too far off the topic. So there is some kind of precedent for the absolutely uncompromising understanding in the thinking now occurring that even sign is too much of a compromise with difference between. Do you see? Does that make sense? Okay.
So that, again, that's this game of question.
Yes. Yeah. Different.
Registers of
Right.
recognition.
Correct. Yes. Okay. All right. Then just one more in Marx's text itself on page 17. I've already alluded to this, just to nail it down, where he himself says about 8 or 9 lines up from the bottom of page 17. Lastly, it will become plain that mankind will not begin any new work, but will consciously bring about the completion of its old work. We are therefore in a position to sum up the credo of our journal in a single word: the self-clarification, critical philosophy of the struggles and wishes of the age. This is a task for the world and for us. It can succeed only as the product of united efforts. What is needed above all is confession and nothing more than... I said the united efforts idea, and here's the Kierkegaardian aspect of the thinking now occurring. The thinking now occurring critique of that notion of the necessity of united efforts is already it's anticipated in this abstract spiritual sense by Kierkegaard. But there is again a precedent for the thinking now occurring critique in my friend Emerson. Emerson, he seems so mild-mannered and unthreatening kind of guy. Just Nietzsche, says he's just so happy. Nietzsche can't understand it. But underneath this kind of pleasant thing, he's saying some really wild things, right? So, and not unrelated to his notion that maybe one ought to consider seriously love as the principle of the state, right? That's a little... Right? Emerson has the idea, which he expresses beautifully, and I just can't... I didn't memorize it, but the notion is that there will be the well-ordered society when each... Now I have to paraphrase. When each person, in effect, stays at home, right? And this is just it's nothing like the lapidary style of Emerson. Each person stays at home and, as it were, is in touch with the one spirit, right? The generative source of the world. When each one is in touch with that one, there will be, for Emerson, as it were, an automatic unity. There will be the streets will be cleaned. It's like saying if everyone acts perfectly responsibly, right? Now,
Well, this is all.
Yeah.
the Omen passage that you're going to quote, where each how
You
that
keep
happens.
jumping ahead of me.
Sorry.
You're cheating. I mean, you're reading ahead. I can't. I'm having trouble keeping up with myself. It may be. I'll have to wait. Okay. But so in other words, it's the completion of an old work, and to imagine that existentially one could complete that work, right, is revolutionary, I mean, deeply so. But that it is not a new work, all right? So in the language of the thinking now occurring, self-consciously, quite explicitly in the text, self-consciously, this is not a new work. It's the completion of an old work, an old project, so to speak. Really, it's the completion of a modern project, envisioned existentially, to say. Whereas the thinking now occurring is in this language now, it is a new work, right? Or better, an essentially new work. And therefore, it's not simply, in a complicated way, it is the completion of an old project, but not essentially so, right? It's actually something, it's something that could not have actually been envisioned within the limits of the old project. So it's something to that effect. All right. So, and therefore, go back to what the question that Todd had raised that I was trying to answer about this kind of faith or the absolute mediator, or faith as the medium for the existence of individuals. The thinking now occurring has something like, something reminiscent of the kind of perfect existentialism of Kierkegaard, the kind of the perfect isolation of the individual, but now no longer in the context of a contrast between a difference between spirit and nature, just saying, but now where spirit, as it were, has thoroughly penetrated nature, right, and therefore the necessity, doesn't preclude some kind of unity of individuals, right, but it does preclude, in principle, the necessity for that unity. So that unity is going to be grounded not in a necessary response to some other than ourselves, right? Some other in the self-other context, but it's a unity that will, should it be visible, all right, will be as it were, the product of a kind of perfect freedom. Right?
Did you say invisible?
Visible. I said visible. And that perfect freedom, just to jump ahead, I'm sure I'll get to, I'm not sure I'll get to it tonight, but we'll get to it. And we may get to it tonight. One of the, again, Little Adam asked last time about the meaning of the term unicity. In a kind of literal sense, it's a kind of uniqueness. But I was suggesting, in response to him, which turns out to be true in the text, it is connected with the notion of love and desirability, and being itself beloved is the term that's used a couple of times in the text here. And so if you were to sort it out a little more than the text does, you might think that this complex unity of perfectly free individuals would in fact be organized, if I can put it that way, by the principle of love, and the consistency with the perfect freedom of the constitution of such an organization of perfectly particular individuals would be the fact that each of them is, in some sense, the mediator having disappeared in one way, to say, each of them would be itself, it would be being itself beloved. Right. So, in other words, when I fall in love, I don't feel like I'm being compelled to do anything. I mean, hey, I love that. Hey, I love this. I love you. Right. I mean, so what makes that, what binds me freely is the belovedness of the object. Right. So, if every particular person is being itself beloved, then you've eliminated the notion of necessity as integral to that fabric. Yeah.
I don't want to get in the way of progress here, but
All right.
just to go back to this question.
Okay.
If these are examples of dualisms, fact and reflection, appearance and essence, for a second, if that's what it are we basically saying that whether the difference between X and Y or A and B, that in this thinking, that the difference between X and B is transcendent as well, without positing what X and B might be. So it's X and Y, A and B. We've focused on the difference between within the couplets, if you will. But it is, I guess what I'm saying is, are the couplets necessary historically to recite? Do they have to make sense in and of themselves and then be transcended in order to... You see what I'm getting at?
I think I do, and I think if I do, to the extent to which I do, I think the answer is yes. In other words, again, going back to the comment I made earlier, history is taken here with utter seriousness in principle. And therefore, the fact that for Kant there's a difference between appearance and substance I'm not sure the thrust of your question exactly. I mean, is not to be erased. It's not to be poo-pooed. It's not to be considered irrelevant to what is now thinkable. Not at all. It's part of the history leading up to. Not the history does not. The history in this sense of the word, that is the retrospective analysis of where we've been, does not in and of itself produce the thinking now occurring, right? On the other hand, the thinking now occurring is not, even in its own terms, fully intelligible without reference to that which is past.
Well, let me just try to restate this briefly.
Okay.
Go off this way. Fact and appearance seem to be related to each other. Reflection and essence, likewise. Right? Just commonsensical application.
It's not the order of his question, though, right? You realize that. You're changing the order. Okay.
No, exactly. Well,
okay.
Fact and reflect. That's right.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
I'm jumbling.
You're
transposing.
You're transposing the proportion, which is legitimate.
Which is something you do later on in the book.
Right.
All the time.
Right.
And so, if I said that the difference between fact and essence is transcendent.
Yes.
You would buy that.
Yes.
So what is the provenience of this transcendence? That's the transcendence doesn't mean obliterated.
Correct.
It means a vantage or a perspective, not perspective, but a new condition of cognition has occurred, such that what happens when tuities appear and tend towards creating armies that head off, that the absolute nature of the distinction no longer holds. And so in each case there would be a wealth of commerce between them that's afforded by the transcendent cognition that would eliminate the possibility of there being a division of all concern between appearance and fact, etc. So, in other words, it isn't that there wouldn't remain contexts in which you would distinguish between a fact and its appearance. It's just that those would not be the basis of a metaphysics that would whack up the entire field of concern, because you already have is that where we are?
I think we're at least there.
At least there.
At least there.
Right. But at least there.
Well, yeah. Going further than that.
Yeah. That there's no ontological difference.
No. I say that
that's where it goes. That
That's right.
You don't have one ontological plane of fact and another ontological plane of appearance,
Right.
which you can then deal with. Okay.
Yeah. That's what I mean by
That's-
at least that is true. That's true.
Would you go more than that?
Well, so now when you say, well, but then we're not left with any kind of, we still may have a context in which we can make a distinction between fact and appearance. I think we have to rethink that at that point. Because if there's an absolute particularization or specification of existence with a CE and a TS, either at the same time, so to speak, then in some sense, the possibility of conflict in some sense exists, right?
Between the existence.
Yeah.
Just because they're also existence doesn't mean that they're not going at each other's throat.
Yeah, it's possible,
Yeah.
right? Now, what to make of that, right? One would have to make of it something essentially different than what one would make of it if one was thinking self-consciously.
But with fact and appearance, you would also want to say that if you, wherever you would make the distinction between fact and appearance, what immediately starts to happen is that fact draws along with it some kind of solidity that is inaccessible to appearance, and appearance
Right.
has some kind of ephemeral or
Right.
effete aspect to it,
Right.
which is not identical
That's right.
with fact. The mere fact that an appearance is also an event doesn't quite handle it when you're talking about kicking the stone with your sore foot. And so that's gone. So that there is no actual fact. There is no rock on the other side of the appearance of the rock. And there is no dissolution of the mere appearance into nothing because it's a mere appearance.
All right.
So in that sense, the two have been brought much closer towards each other.
In
But
some
then-
way
yeah.
identified.
Identified. And yet there still would be some kind of polarization within this fact appearance.
Well, whether now,
A tendency
I want to say
towards-
there would still. Well,
Yeah.
it depends. Now, there would be some. There would still be, in fact, inherently, there must, as it were,
Yeah.
must be some kind of differentiation,
Yeah.
right? But whether or not difference can be adequately understood any longer as polarization is the question. I think.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So
No.
difference
Yeah.
and polarization. I would
Well,
say
for
difference
instance,
remains polarization.
Within, say, Husserlian phenomenology, where the language is polarized, and yet there is definitely a blunting of the between, say, noema and noesis, between the activity of knowing and the thing known. You've removed the thing on the other side of the thing known, and you've also, in a sense, removed the temporarily the reification of the knower in order to have this closed circle.
The phenomenological
Yeah, which
circle.
has a
Right.
noetic pole and a
Okay.
noematic pole. I just meant pole in that sense.
So, in an absolute phenomenology, such as the thinking now occurring,
Yes. You really don't have
you not only remove the
the two transcendents.
backgrounds of the subject and object,
Yes.
but you remove the distinction altogether between the subject and object, between them, right? So if there is a distinction to be made, right? And by the way, technically you remove the subject, or we gotta.
Yeah,
okay.
but
Right.
in removing the
But
subject,
You haven't removed the knower. You haven't removed the knower and the known. So you have a knower and the known that are no longer subject-object related, right? Because that is a polarization. So if you take what would be polar related, not only get rid of their substantive backdrops, as in phenomenology, but get rid of the residuum of those substantive backdrops, get rid of the subject-object definition of the knower and the known.
the noematic core is gone.
Well, in subjectivity's terms, it's gone. Right. But now I have an act of knowing that is the known. which is got to be related to what I was saying a little while ago about an understanding of language or saying or word, which is the reality. All right? Now, within that very flat, infinitely flat surface, right? Is there? I want to say. You see how I said we learn to speak before we know what we're saying, right? Okay. I'm tempted to say within that infinitely flat surface, the question might be: is there room for a difference? Right? But then I have to correct myself and say, within. Well, even within is problematic, but
it is difference. I thought you would say.
You got it. It is. So is difference? But let me speak loosely. Is there any room there for difference? Well, strictly speaking, no. But is there difference there? Yeah. Where is it? It is difference. Okay, and therefore it's a perfectly intelligible surface.
Perfectly differentiated.
But it's been transcended.
Well,
it is transcendence.
The transcendence has occurred before the whole thing flattens out.
That's what flattens it out.
That's what flattens it out.
Is the transcendence. Give transcendence a chance.
Right. Okay.
By the way, I saw a wonderful headline in the garden section of the Times of London a couple of weeks ago. It said, and this guy in his garden, weeding and so on, and it said, "Give peas a chance."
Now that's two strikes.
Sorry. I'm just quoting something.
Oh,
else.
okay, all right.
That's different.
Can I ask a question about that then? Because you say later on, maybe we'll get to it hopefully, that the individual is the other then, or
Yes.
I think that's what you say, or something that's exactly like the individual is the other. So that makes sense.
The individual, I think, I don't know how I phrase it. The individual is the other. The individual, the absolute, is absolutely the other itself. Something like that. Yeah, but you got the yeah.
Okay. So I just want to hear more about that. Then.
All right, we'll get to that.
I think we just keep going over this and refining it, because I had gotten to the point towards the end of the spring where I could locate some experiences which seemed to confirm what you were saying, and then over the summer I really started thinking I have to stop doing that.
Why, are we getting in trouble?
Just keep my experiences with themselves and just try to understand what you're saying without trying to jump the gun on understanding by relating what I might describe in that vocabulary to it. And that sort of seems like maybe we can mature in the process of relating it to it. So it doesn't seem necessary to do that so much to me.
That makes sense to me, what you're saying. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I guess I should just take some note on page 18 of that diagram, and for what it's worth, maybe put some labels on it by way of guidance. In the context of this chapter, the upper right hand, non-being of thought, which I think is pretty clear, is Marx is the guy to be thinking about there. And right across from him, the thought of non-being, absolute subjectivity, we can call Hegel. And the non-thought of non-being, absolute absurdity, I think Kierkegaard is a good candidate for that.
I'm sorry, which is which? Non-thought of that's the one.
Non-thought of non-being, on the extreme left, Kierkegaard. And then the non-thought of being, Husserl, and the being of non-thought on the bottom right. I have Heidegger in mind there. Now I don't want to take time to justify those labels, but
I want to get the labels.
It might help. Right. Might be helpful, and it may come up as we go through.
And the being of what absolute objectivity
thinking now occurring.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. We can do it again.
Yeah,
what are you missing?
Well, I got Marx in the right place, and I think I got Hegel in the right place.
Yeah, on the top line. And then in the middle lines on your left, you should have Kierkegaard, and on the right, thinking now occurring. And then in the bottom left, Husserl, in the bottom right, Heidegger. Which may even be politically correct, for all I know.
What's the bottom left?
Husserl.
All right, so going around, starting with Hegel on the top left, right? We've got Hegel, Marx, TNO, down Heidegger, back to the left Husserl, Kierkegaard.
Right.
And back to the
Why the broken lines?
To show the essential discontinuity of the thinking now occurring against this background. Okay.
Okay.
So does it fit? Yeah. Is it, in any simple sense, a simple extension or direct outgrowth of this into which, so to speak, it can be fitted? No. Okay. So that's something what the broken line is meant to call attention to. Now, speaking of that, so around that, I say maybe take the sentence that leads into that diagram. The now absolutely previous contention was between absolute subjectivity and the predicament of contingent existence, between the materialization of subjectivity itself and the contingent absolute, between perfect inversion, in some sense, of Hegel, very knowledgeable and very deeply knowledgeable. And then on the top of page 19, the transcendental history of the logic of the absolute, the experience itself now of the identity of the absolute. And there, I think we noted last time, or I noted that I use, and it comes up again in tonight's reading, I used the term, it interested me here to see it, the term in the context of the transcendental, the notion of experience. And also, I speak of a transcendental passion of existence, or transcendental passion to exist. And since I'm mentioning that, so I'm saying that it goes back to the question about a kind of immediacy of decision before any kind of self-conscious will and or self-conscious knowledge, that kind of depth of being that's involved here. And more technically, when I speak of the transcendental passion of existence or to exist having a kind of philosophical meaning, like in the like existere, right? The verbal aspect as opposed to the noun aspect, right? That existence is an act of being in some sense, as opposed to some kind of lifeless being in the sense of a traditional notion of a thing, right? So the transcendental passion to exist, as opposed to what? As distinguished from what? As distinguished from what's on the polar opposite on the diagram, from what I characterize as present in Kierkegaard's thought, a transcendent passion to exist, as opposed to a transcendental, right? A kind of absurd, but transcendently real passion to exist would be the Kierkegaardian analog that is transcended now essentially in a transcendental passion to exist, where the passion to exist that is in Kierkegaard merely transcended, not transcendental, not thought, is now, for the first time, transcendental is thought. Okay, okay. But I wanted to. So let me just finish the sentence. So it's simply so the experience itself now, the identity of the absolute, is simply displayed in this constellation, at the bottom of the previous page, in which the ultimate resolution of matter itself is the absolute objectivity of being thought. Gee, I like that. It's interesting. See, the ultimate resolution of matter itself is the objectivity. Is that what it says? Absolute objectivity of being thought. There is no matter itself, as it were, prior to its being thought in the form of an absolute objectivity. Right? So again, the flatness.
Is there not a pun, but a dual meaning there?
In what way?
A being.
Yeah.
Thought.
Yes. It's a deliberate
It is
pun, if you want to put it that. Yeah, but it's an acceptable pun. You know, it's not one that makes you laugh. It's one that makes you think. Right?
Yes. No, that's why I thought.
Right. Okay. The absolute transcendence of absolute negativity. Now, here's where I wanted to go back to Hegel, because and it relates to the diagram, right? The dotted lines are saying the thinking now occurring is not simply continuous with this background. On the other hand, it fits. Right? These dotted lines fit into the undotted lines, right? So there is a real reference backwards to what is past in thought now. Yet there's something essentially new. And I thought of this passage, which I put little pieces of it in that paper that I put on my website, The Person is Absolute Particular. It's interesting to me how all this stuff comes together, in my mind anyway. And I made reference in trying to explain succinctly the person is absolute particular. I made reference to the relationship between Kierkegaard's notion of the particular or single person and the Kierkegaardian, and the Hegelian notion of the absolute individual, the divine idea. That individuality existed existentially by Kierkegaard's single individual. And in that context, in that paper, I made reference to this part of Hegel's Science of Logic, the larger logic, where he's talking about existence, and he says, existence then is not to be taken here as a predicate. This is also relevant, you'll notice, to the way in which Marx, in his text, distinguishes himself from Hegel, right? When he talks about, well, I don't think maybe he did it in that paragraph, I can't remember, but anyway, in tonight's reading someplace, simply put, what he's saying is that single individual is an abstraction. It's really, from Marx's point of view, it's really, by Hegel, it's the substitution of a predicate for the real subjects. That's the way Marx's critique goes of Hegel, right? Hegel has taken an abstraction, and he's abstracted from the real subjects of history, and he's made that abstract predicate, right? He's turned it into a false subject. It's a kind of philosophical analog to Feuerbach's critique of religion, that God is an unreal subject upon which has been placed the predicate of the divine attributes that are really abstracted from the concrete human nature. That's Feuerbach, right? So we're dealing with the subject-predicate problem in, now I'm going to show you also in Hegel, and in Marx, and in Feuerbach. This is the problem that goes back to Augustine when he's trying to sort out what the Trinity was. And Augustine had the good sense to deny that God could be spoken about properly in terms of subject and predicate, right? Or even of substance and attribute, which would be a kind of metaphysical analog to subject and predicate distinction, right? All right. So this issue hasn't quite gone away, and it's operative here. So go back to Hegel now. He says existence then is not to be taken here as a predicate or as a determination of essence. So existence for Hegel is not a predicate of essence, the proposition of which would run essence exists or has existence. Right? That is, I can predicate of essence that it exists. Hegel says no, right? Existence can't be a predicate in that sense. On the contrary, essence has passed over into existence. Existence is essence's absolute emptying of itself. Think now of Tom Maltise's theology, which deeply reproduces in an American context this. And I found myself using the word kenosis in here.
Yeah.
It made me nervous, except when I read it carefully, the context, because I speak of an absolute kenosis. Right?
Okay.
That's okay. Existence is essence is Hegel. Absolute emptying of itself. You could say an absolute kenosis of itself, or self-alienation. Now there's the clear line of demarcation, right? That the emptying out of the absolute in the thinking now occurring is not absolutely. It's not it may be an alienation, but it's not a self-alienation, right? It's an othering, right? Where alienation now has lost its traditional meaning if it's not at the expense of some self. Okay, so existence's essence is absolute emptying of itself or self-alienation, nor has it remained behind See? Nor has it remained behind on the further side of it, says Hegel. The proposition should therefore run, essence is existence. It is not distinct from its existence. Essence has passed over into existence insofar as essence as ground no longer distinguishes itself from itself as the grounded, or insofar as this ground has sublated itself, the Aufhebung, right, the supersession. But this self-sublation, this self-overcoming, this absolute emptying out of itself, or absolute self-alienation, by essence passing over into existence. But this negation, says Hegel, is equally essentially its position. So here again, in part, the thinking now occurring, it doesn't want to simply throw out the word nothing in tonight's reading, and further on it'll bring it back up again a number of times. So a nice, which I may actually say in the text somewhere from time to time, but a nice everyday way of putting it is that it's nothing but existence. It's nothing but existence, right? So this negation is equally essentially its position, or absolutely positive continuity with itself. Existence is the reflection of the ground into itself, its identity with self achieved in its negation, and therefore the mediation that has posited itself as identical with itself, and thereby is an immediacy. All right. Now that last part I quote in the paper to explain what's going on in Kierkegaard's notion of the single individual who is really the particular existential embodiment, as it were, of the God, right? In a way that out Hegels, as I put it in the text. Now, the reason I thought of this passage again, when I look at what I wrote here, back on page 19, I'm saying that what we're dealing with here is the absolute transcendence of absolute negativity. Okay? And so to fairly precisely relate it to Hegel's text here, where he's speaking of this emptying out of essence into existence, the essence exists. Existence is not predicated of essence. Essence passes over into existence, and essence exists, he says. But it's a self-alienation, and he emphasizes, although it doesn't remain behind, right, not remaining behind, nevertheless, it, in this, undergoing this, this self-negation, it is equally, essentially, its position, or absolutely positive continuity with itself. Okay? So the break, the distinction, rather precisely, I would say, between the thinking now occurring in Hegel, despite superficial appearances, is that in the thinking now occurring, when, as it were, essence passes over into existence, when essence exists, in Hegelian words, it does not do so in continuity with itself. Right? It does not do so as an act of self-emptying. All right? So the emptying out, all right, it not only does it not remain behind, but it is not continuously transformed into existence. Do you say? There is an absolute break. So to put it very simply, where Hegel says essence exists, the thinking now occurring says essence absolutely exists. Absolutely, meaning absolutely without reserve. Absolutely without its being paradoxically, that's the great paradox of the death of God theology, right? The form of the self-fulfillment of the divine.
So it's an actual new step in which existence is utterly new, and existence now contains what had been the notion of essence utterly within itself in such a way that the old idea of existence, which required essence and for it to become intelligible, is now intelligible on its own.
Right. It's perfectly intelligible and immediately so.
But it doesn't sound too good for essence. It sounds great for existence. not for essence.
Well, but it sounds good for essence.
Because essence absolutely exists. So what's the problem?
Well, it would be okay if there was any vestige of essence.
You're so self-conscious.
But that's
That's right. I like that though. There's no vestige.
No vestige.
Absolutely no
essence
vestige.
is obliterated.
Not a yeah, but a vestige of essence. Would you rather have a vestige of essence, or would you rather absolutely exist as
I'd
essence?
rather have a you.
Absolutely existing essence.
I'd rather have a you instead of. I'd rather be able. Forgive the pronoun I.
The I is fine. I is fine. I is in. Okay. Let's move in further here if we can. I notice also another point of contact with Marx's thinking and the thinking now occurring. It appears in a couple of places. For example, on page 20, but elsewhere. I don't know whether I can find it. But on page 20, you can find the other places, where he says in that second quotation on page 20 from Marx, in the last sentence, the predicate, the essence, can never exhaust the spheres of its existence in a single one, but only in many ones. Now notice there, it's so interesting, right? Having just quoted Hegel, right? Marx must understand it because he says the predicate, the essence, right? Existence is not a predicate of essence. Essence is passed over to existence. Essence as existing or as existence is a predicate here, but he says it can never be exhausted in a single one. It cannot be the vestige of this divine idea. It can't be an ideal, right? A vestige of some ideal thing, and therefore, again, which he's already implied in the earlier passage that I quoted, it is. It's exhausted not in a single one, but only in many ones. So the issue of the one and the many, which goes back to our friend Thales at the very foundation of Western philosophy, okay, is still with us here, right? And in a sense, taking what I'm baptizing here as a kind of existentialist understanding of Marx's thinking. A collectivistic existentialism, if that's the right term, he has in his own way then overcome, right? He's gone beyond Hegel, overcoming the distinction between the ultimate or absolute world historical individual and the many manifestations thereof in Hegel's philosophy. He has made that essence, the unity of that essence, exhausted only in the many. So I'm saying in some sense he has in effect the parallel analogously to what Hegel does with essence passing over into existence. The one in Marx has passed over into the many, right? It is the one in some sense, not in a Hegelian sense, right? But logically it is passed over, it is emptied out, maybe not self-emptied, right? In Marx, not self-emptied, but it is emptied out in effect into the many ones which exhaust the essence, which are
distributed into the many.
Yeah, I think he uses the term, right? Yeah.
There's a funny use of distributed that could be right. When you talk about something being logically distributed, but not materially distributed. Certainly,
yes. Right.
Certainly,
right.
It isn't like it's been cut up. And so that it gets smaller and smaller.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But there is a kind of
a logical distribution, right? Okay. Okay. Now we're coming closer to that mediator section on page 21.
Actually, I have
Sure.
a question on 21.
Okay.
I have kind of lost the meaning of the middle term. What do you mean by middle term?
Okay. Let me see if we can pick it up here.
It's also where mediator comes in as well.
Yeah, right. Well, let me pick that sentence then. Before now in Marx, there is history. Is that
Right before that.
Oh, before that even. Okay, wait a minute. I see. All right, so we'll back up a little further. Let's see. We need a.
Speaking of potentially intelligible real existing things the potentiality of the middle term, the absolute alternative of the process of the mystical from the transformation. So, what is the reference to the middle term? Yeah, and then later on, I mean, you use it repeatedly on that.
I just want to get the full context here.
Well, the sentence begins on page 12.
Well, on page 20. On page 20.
I know.
It could. I mean, it's possible. I mean,
Absolutely.
it's not out of the question, but in fact, it doesn't. Okay. The thought begins on page 12. Okay. But let's go back to page 20. Itself, the material kenosis of absolute thought, the pure positiveness of absolute matter, historical materialism, which I guess ties in with what I was just saying a moment ago, in effect, right? The material kenosis of absolute thought, something like, you see, Marx would not be comfortable with the self-emptying, okay? But nevertheless, absolute thought, emptied out, right? Materially, or into matter, or as matter, in the form of matter, passing over into matter, maybe it might be a way of understanding it. The pure positiveness of absolute matter. Historical materialism is the necessary but consequently imperfect. Consequent to its being necessary, right? In other words, it's the necessity inherent in Marx, which, by the way, on another level comes out in his notion that, in a certain sense, the ultimate outcome of history is inevitable, right? And in that he shares that ultimate fundamentalness of necessity with Hegel, right? Politically or even materially. He doesn't get so that there's another example of how he does. He materializes the absolute thought of Hegel. He doesn't get beyond it to something new, and he's very aware of that. Not a new work, right? The completion, to turn. He does just like Kierkegaard. See? I mean, Kierkegaard doesn't say Hegel's an idiot. I mean, he does, but he doesn't mean it. He says what Hegel says is fine. Now the question, but it's just an abstraction. The task is to exist. And Marx is saying, well, I'm saying for him here, but assuming this is correct, that what's happening in Marx is not saying Hegel's, in that sense, he is a philosopher. In that sense, he's a thinker. He understands the thought profoundly. But it's incomplete. And what is the completion for Marx? It's the materialization of it, right?
Standing Hegel on its head.
Yeah. Okay. So historic is all right. So it's the necessary, but consequently, from the perspective of thinking now occurring, imperfect abstraction of existence itself from the absolutely arbitrary abstraction of subjectivity. Now, notice what I say there, and this is another thing that's deeply relevant to trying to understand what the thinking now occurring understands of itself. I'm saying, notice, I'm not saying it's bad because it's an abstraction of existence itself from the absolutely arbitrary abstraction of subjectivity. I'm saying it's bad because it's an imperfect abstraction. I mean, but this raises the very interesting question, which is not going to go away in the thinking now occurring. What is a perfect abstraction? Do you see? But I'm saying that the absolute particularity of the individual is the perfect abstraction. It's the schema, or it's the surface that is transcendence. Do you see? It is the being there that is the construction of the essence of the world, right? or it is essentially world construction.
Could you go on with that sentence?
I am going to. I'm going to. Okay. But consequently, imperfect from the absolutely arbitrary, in effect, the purely temporal priority of reason itself.
No. The piece of the sentence you didn't talk about.
Which one was that?
From the absolutely arbitrary abstraction of subjectivity.
Oh, you mean you want me to cut? I thought I read it, but you meant
no. It's just that also has this kind of subtle polyphilibus thing going on inside it, and I
absolutely arbitrary abstraction of subjectivity. Yes, right. In other words, so again, or maybe
is
that's
it subjectivity that's performing this absolutely arbitrary abstraction, or is it an abstraction from subjectivity? An arbitrary active abstraction from subjectivity, or subjectivity is performing an arbitrary
absolutely arbitrary abstraction, and Marxism is an abstraction of existence itself from the arbitrary activity of subjectivity.
Okay.
All right, the arbitrary.
Okay, so that's the bite, that it's being abstracted from from subjectivity, but imperfectly so.
Yes, I think so.
In other words, subjectivity proposes its existence.
Well, it's even more complicated because it's not only that subjectivity is an abstraction for which Marx is abstracting imperfectly.
Yes.
But the problem is that the subjectivity's abstraction is faulted here because it's arbitrary, because it's absolutely arbitrary. So in
subjectivity arbitrarily abstracts something that becomes its vision of existence, and then there is an imperfect Marx's imperfect abstraction of existence from that.
Right.
And so it's like the tooth has got to come all the way out.
Okay. All right.
It's a parsing of a sentence.
Right.
Remember that one time.
All right. In effect, the purely temporal priority of reason itself to the categorical absolute. The existing individual. Should I pause that too?
Yeah.
All right. The categorical.
Actually, if you did it with a couple of these sentences this deeply, we would
Okay.
probably get
All right.
off
All right. So.
the purely temporal.
All right. The purely temporal priority of reason itself to the categorical absolute. The categorical absolute, therefore, would take us back to the thinking now occurring. Right. So, in Marx, there is a priority of reason itself, right? In other words, there is some sort of absolute reason functioning in Marx, which has been abstracted from the absolutely arbitrary abstraction of subjectivity, right? It has been imperfectly abstracted, right? And because it's imperfectly, if you tie it in with other things that are said in the text, therefore Marxism is understood to be in essentially rational materialism, or in essentially historical materialism, or an imperfectly rational, or an imperfect rationalization of existence, something to that effect. Okay, so there is. So in other words, it's not that there's no reason in Marx, but it's by virtue of this imperfect abstraction from an already arbitrary abstraction. It is at least a couple of times removed from the thinking now occurring. It is, but it is a form of reason prior in time to the thinking now occurring, prior in time, temporally prior to the categorical absolute, but not, if I use an Aristotelian analog, but not in reality prior. Okay, which may be understood in a couple of ways, but one being that. It's not prior in the logical sense. It's not an a priori. It's not a pre-existing condition for the thinking now occurring.
Sorry, just another simple term. When you use categorical, you're meaning it like categorical imperative as another kind of intensifier. Categorical doesn't mean that it's producing categories. It means that it's without categorically specified cavilling about itself, like the categorical imperative, as opposed to what's the thing that's compared to the, you know what I'm saying? The hypothetical.
Hypothetical. Right. Well.
Maybe just is everybody with that? You know
But as much as I would like to simply accommodate you with an unqualified yes, I want to say
something.
Yeah, I want to say yes. No, I want to say yes. It has that meaning, categorical as opposed to hypothetical. Categorical, absolute, kind of absolute, in that sense. But no, doesn't. It doesn't. It is not that it does not envision an essentially new category.
It's just the grammar of where the categorical, where those, in other words, it's not a categorization of the absolute in the sense of a division of it into a bunch of categories. It's that the absolute itself becomes a new category of absoluteness.
Yes, okay. Yeah. Right, okay. All right, well, we're trying to get to Voltraud's question here. So the existing individual things now seem to now seem to terminate essentially in existence itself for the first time in history. now clearly perceived, let's see if we get the flow of this. All right, so the material kenosis, the pure historic materialism is necessary, but consequently imperfect abstraction, in effect, the purely temporal priority. Now clearly perceived in the absolutely unconditioned existence of reason itself in the form of the non-tautological formality
This is
of the
unfinished business from before.
of
We
the
never really got to what tautological stuff is about.
all right. That is of the formality of absolute differentiation. All right.
Tautology meaning repetition here.
Yes, and right. Well, I think I've said previously in the text that that he objects. Yeah, in that paragraph on page 20, which we were in, but in the first sentence, I'm saying that the essential objection of rational existence to the materialization of absolute thought is to its being a tautologous formality, not to its being a formality, but to its being a tautologous, that is, empty formality. So, in the context, remember my general philosophical dictum is that all philosophical language has to be contextualized. In the context, what's being said is that Marx is objecting to the idealism of Hegel because he sees it, he's not objecting to its formality, he's objecting to its tautological nature, which has the connotation of saying nothing new. But, that's the pun. Saying something new, existing nothing new, not doing anything, you see? Not producing, it's not materialized. So in that sense, it's right. So the materialization of absolute thought, if that's what Marx is doing, is the answer to the immaterial, purely tautological nature of the Hegelian idea, but not an objection to the Hegelian idea as such, any more than, in the deepest sense, Kierkegaard is objecting to the Hegelian idea. He's objecting to it as an idea with which I begin and end. Then it's objectionable. But it is the only idea in which I have any framework for the absurdity of Kierkegaard's position, and Hegel's idea is the framework in which I can understand its rejection as idea, tautological self-involvement, kind of philosophy that doesn't change the world in his critique of Feuerbach, kind of masturbatory thinking, do you see? That's what's being objected to, not the idea, but it's not being inverted into matter, not being emptied out into the one not being emptied out, distributed among the many real actors in the world historical process.
He actually comes as bespeaking the incarnation, saying the very job that Hegel says he's doing isn't getting done.
Right, yes. Oh, I think so. And in fact, did I mention to you, maybe somebody knows more about this than I do, but his, what would it be in Germany, gymnasium dissertation was on what? Guess what? Hey, Marx, that is. Marx.
St. Paul.
Christ. Isn't that great? That's so great. Okay. So, yes, deep incarnation, again, deep incarnational idea here. Yeah. Okay. I'll try and still get to the middle here. All right. Okay. So, parenthetical remark here. Is that in the middle there? Yeah, it's in. I got parentheses and parentheses. Right? I.e., for the first time in history, clearly perceived alienation of absolute difference, in which form before now the transcendent differentiation of fact and reflection was formally overcome in the form of the identity of pure content, non-being, insistently taken as the starting point ex cogitatione, the potentially intelligible, real, existent things, the potentiality of the middle term, the absolute alternative to the process of mystical transformation. Okay. Starting with the identity of pure content, non-being insistently. Now, this is something I'm going to deal with a little more in a different way later on here, and we definitely got to do it somewhere. But what I'm the basic framework here is that again, I'll use the analogy to Kierkegaard since we spent so much time on Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard's problem as an anti-Hegelian Hegelian is that the faith that he describes is a faith that is related to his natural understanding in a perfectly polar opposition. They're incompatible. There's a war there. As soon as I posit faith, as Kierkegaard understands it, good Hegelian that he is, posits it in his sense, right, existentially. He's at war with his self-understanding. That natural self that has the temerity, the effrontery, the evil disposition from a Hegelian point of view to posit this is even worse than conscience, right? Faith is like taking conscience and cubing it, right, from a Hegelian point of view. This absolute singularity of every individual, right, spiritual over against nature, right? That self that has the temerity to do that is, however, unfortunately, in a Hegelian universe, in and of itself, nothing. It has no standing. It has no truth of its own. It's, right, you see? All right. Analogously, to the extent to which this is a real work going on here in Marx to empty out, to materialize in a way different from Kierkegaard, but not altogether different from Kierkegaard, to the extent to which there is a parallel here, he also is, from a strictly Hegelian idealistic understanding, he is starting with not the form, he's starting with the content. Do you see? So in other words, and he has nothing, it's not so simple that he's anti-idea. No. He's anti-tautological idea. He's anti-non-productive idea, abstract idea, fantastical idea. He wants a materialized idea, but the materialized idea presupposes what? That the form of the idea is the work of the real subjects of natural history.
The propertyless proletariat.
Okay, and the propertyless proletariat would be a very good economic analog of the nothingness of the content of the idea. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. So now, so the potentially intelligible, real, existent things, the potentiality of the middle term. So the potentially intelligible, real, existent things, the middle term here is parallel to the notion of the real, existent things.
What does the term middle term say?
The middle term would suggest logically the notion of essence. So just as in Hegel, the essence passes over into existence, so that existence is not a predicate of essence. Okay? But if, on the other page, the predicate, the essence, can never exhaust the spheres of its existence in a single one, but only in the many ones, says Marx on the other page. All right? So these existent, real existent, what do I say on this page? Real existent things, this multiplicity of real existence is the essence, a la Hegel, not distinguished from existence as subject from predicate, but itself existing, the essence existing, now in Marx, materialized, emptied out into matter. No longer a merely logical truth, a merely tautological truth, right? The revolution is the materialization of the fact that essence exists, that the middle term.
The middle term of the three being essence and existence. Is it those?
Well, you could do it that way. He does it different ways in different places. I would say being, essence, and notion.
Notion.
is probably the fundamental way in which Hegel does that. So the notion is the overcoming for Hegel.
This is not a syllogistic reference.
It's the three divisions of this
Well,
book.
I'm sorry?
The three divisions of the big love.
Of this one. Oh, yeah. Oh, well, we could look. Yeah, but these divisions are broken down again. Being, determinate being for self. That's one way.
But the whole thing is being, and then the next one is.
Yeah, book 1 is the doctrine of being. Book 2 is the doctrine of essence. Let's see, where's book 3?
Here it is.
Well, no, there's a volume. All right, volume 2, doctrine of the notion. So, okay, so that makes sense, right? Being, essence, and notion. And I was about to say, in Hegel, the notion overcomes the momentary, in the profound sense of the word for Hegel, the momentary opposition between being and essence. Okay, and then within essence, we have to consider the relationship between essence and existence. Okay. So he's got threes within threes.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, all right. Okay, so so to go back to Jim's comment.
They're not syllogisms. They're Hegelian threes.
Well, yes, but here's the thing: when you look at Hegel, and this is very clear. I do this exhaustively in Faith and Philosophy. Logic for Hegel is, Marx, I and Marx would say, well, this is a logic book. Now, of course, it's an unusual logic book. You wouldn't hand this to any freshman anyway, right? But nevertheless, it's a book in logic. It's called a logic. Hegel understands that the logic is identical, as he says, with metaphysics, the science of things held in thought. Okay? Well, we're getting closer to reality from a Marxian point of view, but the identity of logic and metaphysics is still not materialized. But I want to come back to this question about, is this a logical syllogism in a narrow sense of the word? For Hegel, the divine idea is a living syllogism. And the divine idea is the ultimate and absolute truth of the whole, the totality of everything that is. So what Hegel understands is that the whole, I want to say the whole, not simply the material universe in a narrow sense, the whole universe of being, all right, in Hegel is a living syllogism. So already the difference between logic and the real, the word and the real, is overcome in Hegel. It's not materialized. There's still right, but he's already overcome that difference. And so this is accepted as a previously arrived at understanding. I mean, that the middle term here is logical, not simply in a textbook sense, although it has that reference, but it has to do with the middle term of reality, as it were. Right? Okay. Now, can we? You also had a question about the middle. Have we? I think I did kind of answer the mediator before, but I can go on if you want. Yes or no?
What is it? It's at the bottom of
It's on the same page. I'm trying to. Did you have a? I guess. I mean, one of the questions that would occur to me if I were reading the text or listening to this is, well, wait a minute. You go from middle term to mediator. Is that part of your original question? Like you have personalized the middle term. Okay, but that's not an accident. I mean, I'm not. It's true. No time is taken out to explain that here, right? But the notion is that being, the ultimate notion, which I think is said someplace in the text, is being is a person, right? And now being has to be understood, right? But understanding being and understanding person, understanding the relationship between the one and the many, qua being, qua person, persons, right? And so I think this is retrospective. This was not intentional leading up to it. Retrospectively, I would say that the whole difficulty of the logic, the three digits, the 0 and the 1, which are not quite what they would be in Boole or Peirce, but especially the unum is a good hat to hang this thing on. In other words, in the unum I have a kind of index of the overcoming of the polarity between the one and the many. Right? It's true of the way all three of the digits operate in the logic, but in other words, the logic also overcomes the difference between the one and the many. I mean, but it does so in this, right? And where the logic, at least on the analogy to Hegel's understanding of logic, right, is not simply a logic, it's not simply a game to play for electronic purposes or other purposes, it's talking about the fundamental elements of the constitution of the real world. Right? So it's at this fundamental level in the thinking now occurring, the distinction between the one and the many is essentially overcome. How that is remains to be seen. Yeah.
So what's the relationship when you say that the absolute is the absolute mediator, and then later on, a couple pages later, you say that the absolute itself is individuated? I mean, I get that as the particularity of an individual person.
Right.
Is individuated. So,
well, therefore, the absolute mediator in the thinking now occurring, as opposed to in Marx, is as absolute mediator is. It's a question of language. It's absolutely so, and the evidence, so to speak, the logical evidence of its being absolutely so, is the perfect differentiation.
Right. And a question about Christ. So is Christ referred to as the mediator in Greek in the New Testament?
Oh, I see. Well, that's a good question. Yeah, sure. Don't ask me where.
What's the Greek word? What's the...
I don't know. Offhand, it doesn't come to mind.
Well, Mary is the mediatrix.
But that's a subsequent development.
By the way, while you're thinking...
I don't know, but I'll look it up. Yeah.
While you're thinking about that, are the intellectual descendants of persons?
Only the male.
Now, on the we've already touched on it, but I want to nail down the text on page 22. In the essentially tautologous, page 22 in the first paragraph, beginning on that page, in the essentially tautologous thought now occurring for the first time in history, the essence of thought is its being absolutely identical. The thing perceived is actuality itself, or absolutely unconditioned identity, which goes another way of talking about this absolute particularity of existence. In the absolute, I've already touched on this, but I wanted to put it in the text. In the absolute kenosis of absolute thought, right, which is what my critique of the continuity remaining in Hegel, in that emptying out, which is a self-emptying and so forth, right? So here is just to get that absolute emptying in the text. And then the unicity on page 23, at the top of the page, it is now absolutely evident that the absolute essence is sorrow for sin, that even the love of truth is not truly loving of truth. And by the way, this language refers back to the epilogue to Novitas Mundi, if you want to go back and look at that in this context, because I talk of the Trinity there as a loving of truth and a truly loving of truth being the role that the Spirit is understood to have there intellectually, right? So, and so the unification of the two by the third is underlying this logic here, and therefore, and by the way, so go back to the middle thing. There are other ramifications of the use of the middle and the absolute middle, which become explicit later on in the text when we get to the discussion of pers, right? Because that thirdness, which we've already discussed, I think, thirdness in pers, categorically, is that category which is the mediator between firstness and secondness, right? And it is, as he says, always in its nature relative. So another departure, not totally unprepared for in American pragmatism, is the role in pers of the real mediating between ultimately differentiated first and second, not collapsible as in Hegel into some simple unity, do you see? So the differentiated trinity that is the unity of being in Peirce, with the difference that in the thinking now occurring, that already more real thirdness in Peirce, and he would understand that technically, that is, that already no longer nominalist understanding of thirdness, that he accuses Hegel of being a nominalist, right? But understanding that in reality, right, that differentiation is ultimately real. In Peirce, that thirdness is nevertheless of its own nature relative. So the thinking now occurring relates positively to the reality of the thirdness in Peirce. It departs from Peirce by asserting that thirdness is in effect an absolute, like firstness and secondness. So it equalizes. So you could look at it this way, that from a Peircean point of view, there's no real thirdness in Hegel, because the middle term is only there to be sublated, you see, so that the first and the last, the first will come to be seen as having emptied itself out, self-divided, self-negated itself in the form of the absolute second. That would be a Hegelian way of reading that. That collapse never takes place in Peirce, right? So in that sense, if the thirdness is never is forever, as it were, dependent upon the beginning and the end, there's no ultimate final simplification. So what I was about to say was then already in pragmatism, thirdness has taken on a reality that it doesn't have in Hegel. So the critique here is, in effect, it's not yet essentially real, right? It's a formal reality. It's not, and so, but an absolute third blows Peirce's schema sky high, because if the third is as absolute as the two things between which it is mediating, then we have introduced a kind of radical discontinuity. See, the thirdness, which is of its very nature, is what? It's the principle really of continuity. And once we have, what does it mean to have an absolute continuity? See? Absolute, right? Okay. 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 Now, what got me into that? The loving of truth business. If it is not, all right, so it's not truly loving of truth, it is not being itself the beloved. It is now absolutely evident that being, so if you take the Trinitarian notion as articulated in the epilogue to Novitas Mundi, and take the notion, the incarnational notion, and take the notion that the mediator in one way has, as it were, disappeared, vanished, but is real in this perfectly differentiated surface, then that loving relationship, which I said would account for the perfectly free interrelationship of the existence, is so only if, in some sense, each of those existence is being the beloved itself. Right? If it isn't, it is that incarnationally in some way, right? I would say qua person. All right. And so I call this the consolation of freedom itself, the absolute forgiveness itself. And without going into it, Jim raised the question last time tangentially, if not by way of a cosine, of sin. And so, again, it's a question of overcoming the difference between this and that, okay? And in a certain sense, forgiveness is a kind of index of the overcoming of the difference, right? In other words, forgiveness is in some way the overcoming of sin, but where there's no sin, there's no forgiveness, right? So in other words, how can I put it? What is overcome is not so much, it's not the difference between sin and forgiveness, it's probably the difference between innocence and sin, right? The difference between the fallen and the unfallen nature. And in some sense, forgiveness is analogous to the absolute middle. See? And so if there's an incarnational reality that is now thought for the first time, one simple way of getting at that is that is in the context of forgiveness, right? And forgiveness is a kind of breaking of the connections between persons. I mean, the bindings between persons, right? It's a kind of free. To forgive someone is an act of freedom. If you've ever been tempted to do so, you realize it's tough. Right?
It's an actual novation.
Yeah.
It actually starts again.
Yeah.
Right.
It means
Right.
no longer from
Right.
here on in relating to the prior.
Right. But on the other hand, it has no meaning without taking seriously the notion of sin.
Yeah.
Just as so analogously, I would say, in the bigger question that keeps coming up, the thinking now occurring in a certain way has no meaning without the past. Without the past form of thought.
It's a kind of repetition of the Pauline position in relationship to the law,
Okay.
in the sense that the overturning of the law requires the law. So there has to have been the law that creates the conviction of sin, so that the law can be overturned, and the new dispensation can
Okay.
occur.
All right.
So it seems as an analogous situation in relation to the same subject.
And also Christ is understood to be the fulfillment of the law, not just simply the overturning of the law,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Of the genuine intention of the law.
Yeah.
Right.
But the law had to have been there
Yeah,
in order
yeah.
to create the
Right.
conditions for the sense that it hadn't been fulfilled.
Right.
Can you say something quickly about the
Okay.
difference between Marx's confession and now what you're calling?
The sorrow.
Yeah, the sorrow. The sorrow somehow being the prerequisite for the forgiveness? Somehow?
Yeah, I guess quickly I would say it goes back to my notion of the importance in the thinking now occurring of the notion of a kind of primacy of experience and passion. Okay? So it's one thing to confess, it's another thing to be sorry. That would be a pedestrian way of putting it, but it's that kind of a difference.
Does that then even go back to the beginning about whether or not the difference can be overcome by the saying, and in that sense it's not overcome by the actual saying of it? And I know there are many different senses of this.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Well, I do distinguish between merely saying and the saying itself. So yes, it's not overcoming by merely saying.
Yeah, which Marx is doing, he's merely saying it in a certain sense.
Relative to thinking, compared to Hegel, he's doing more than merely saying it.
Exactly.
But compared to thinking now occurring, I would say he's merely saying it.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. Okay, and the other place I wanted to stop off, I would like to get a glove on. I don't know what to do here. I have so much to do. I want to get a glove on this, and we can maybe backtrack if we need to at the beginning of the next period, but I wanted to get to this because I think it's useful. Pages 33 and 34. And as I say, we're going to run out of time in about 10, 11 minutes, so what I'm skipping over we can revisit next time, but this is tied in with what is developing as a kind of way of thinking here, and it ties in with a couple of things we started with. On page 33, after this is in the context of another analogous distinction between what Marx is doing and what the thinking now occurring understands is not only between a relative, again, it's all relative. It's like form and matter in Aristotle. You know, what is form to matter is to a higher form matter itself. Okay, so Marx is relatively concrete compared to Hegel, but still abstract compared to the concretion that is now thought in the thinking now occurring. And analogously, he has a notion of a absolutely unconditioned individuation, I'm saying, but he has it generically as opposed to qua particular. Right? So that's another way of saying he's the idealism, right? The imperfect abstraction from the abstraction of idealistic subjectivity translates in here to the generic, the notion of a generic individuation, as opposed to now what in effect is being understood to be a perfect abstraction, or a absolutely unconditioned individuation of the species. That is, the absolute individuation of the body itself in essence, precluding the generic being itself of the non-being of thought, real or ideal. All right, so if Marx is understood to be making ideal non-being real in the revolution, the propertyless proletariat are the real non-being, the real nothingness of the world. Okay, that distinction, which is valid over against Hegel, is not to the point. Right, it doesn't go far enough in the context of the thinking now occurring. Indeed, historical materialism is now clearly seen as transcendental being before now, just as that thinking upon which it, qua absolute, inessentially depended, is seen to belong essentially to the past. That is, its absolute contingency is experienced as being no longer intelligible per se. Now, for the first time, the actually existing individual is the absolute specification of matter. All right, so you slow the sentence down. The actually existing individual is the absolute specification of matter. In the paper that I referred to and I put on my site, I end up by taking Peirce's language, completely spinning him in his grave, right, and attributing to the actually existing particular person, as it were, the predicate, better the identity, terminus of the world. Okay? So this would be an early way of trying to get at that in this context. The thought of the individual is the embodiment of matter itself. Right? Goes back to something I was saying before, that matter has no, as it were, no pre-existence to its formality. Right? I guess I could say in Aristotelian terms that in the thinking now occurring, there is no prime matter. Right? And before now, what was practical in Kant was the transcendence of alienation qua matter. Before now, what was practical in Hegel was the transcendence of alienation qua form. Before now, what was practical in Marx was the transcendence of alienation qua existence. So let me just pause there. So when I speak of Marx as kind of an analog to Kierkegaard in his own very original way, and very important historical way, existentializing the Hegelian idea, right? This language here would be consistent with that notion, and you can see that over against the merely formal way in which it is said that Hegel has transcended alienation, right? And Kant materially so, I say. And then I thought to myself, well, how can I explain? And let me just jump ahead to say that, well, let me read a little further and then come back to explaining it. Now, for the first time in history, now that the identity of the two, the difference between this and that, the identity of the two is absolutely unconditioned. That is, now that the transcendent difference is no longer overcome by being identified with one or the other, no longer, that is, having, as it were, to choose between them, being itself yet another thing, and then this third thing hanging out there beyond, so to speak, these two between which I'm going to have to make some decision, right? That's no longer the case, right? That the difference between these two is no longer there, right? There's no choice between one or the other. And also, at the same time, because the third now has been made perfectly real, right? The being itself is no longer yet some other thing to be dealt with. Right? Now that the transcendent difference is overcome by being identified with both absolutely, now what is practical is the transcendence of alienation qua absolute. Now difference itself exists absolutely. I might have said, to go back to my reading of Hegel's text, now essence itself exists absolutely, which I already said more succinctly before, right? Existence itself is differentiated, right? And if I think of, I might have said existence itself is essentialized, because what is essence? It's species. It's the very embodiment of the intelligible, of the. Just so to say. So essence is like intelligible form. You can go back to Plato. Okay. So existence itself is essentialized. Existence itself is intelligible. Existence itself, what did I say? Is differentiated. Okay. Now what I wanted to do, this is not quite in the text, but it's there underlying it, right? And it goes back to something I was saying earlier in response to absent little Adam here about my uncomfortableness with making some kind of difference between ontology and morality. In the context of the language here, which is very abstract, I thought if I could make it more concrete by starting with in what way is Kant understood to be dealing with the material or the transcendence of alienation qua matter, as opposed to Hegel doing so qua form, right? And I thought, speaking of categories, of the difference between Kant and Hegel on the issue of the categorical imperative. Right? Now let's see, I want to get I need to, in order to fill this out, I need to continue in the text a bit, so this won't be obscure. Now, for the first time in history, the state of being itself has changed in essence. Being itself is the other itself in essence. Right? The actuality of the individual is the other itself. And the key thing is, not simply that the individual is the other itself, the actuality of the individual is the other itself. I mean, one of the reasons I can't polarize the difference between enemies is that the enemy, in some sense, is the actuality, the concrete actuality of my consciousness at this here and now. Okay? But I don't want to get onto that. We'll come back to that. The actuality of the individual is the other itself. Before now, historical materialism was the form of an essential difference, the form of a universally new society, the abolition of the freedom of the finite individual in favor of the product of an absolutely conditioned thought, the formally infinite freedom of the individual. All right? Embodying self-consciously the universality of real and ideal relations, the material transcendence of community itself. The unity of appropriation itself, in which social existence is a mere form, the non-existent private essence not transcended in the abolition of private property in favor of community property. Indeed, the non-existence before now of the inalienable absolute, of society itself inalienable, necessitated the constant interruption of the forces of production themselves, the perpetual repetition of violence. The form of the inalienable absolute before now is in fact the alienation of the body itself, society essentially being connected, the natural man, the body of man essentially inarticulate. Now, what I wanted to impose on this distinction, and we're going to have to come back to it, but let me lay it out. In Kant, if we start with the categorical imperative, we have a notion, goes back to my notion in Kant's notion of freedom associated with human reason, set over against, in a non-synthetic way, the purely mechanical, necessitated operation of the natural schema, right? So that the moral law, the categorical imperative, you could say, despite Hegel, but Hegel probably understands this, is quite appropriately devoid of content, which is Hegel's complaint. It's devoid of content. It's an ought in a purely abstract way because it has inherently, metaphysically, necessarily in Kant's understanding, is understood to be abstracted from and at variance with and not evident in the material conditions of our existence, in a kind of proto-Kierkegaardian sense, at war with the necessity of our natural conditions, our natural inclinations, and so forth and so on. When Hegel synthesizes that duality in Kant, he, in effect, identifies the is and the ought. He identifies freedom and necessity. Marx is building on that, and Marx, all right, so the highest level of abstraction is Kant's categorical imperative. Ask Hegel, he'll tell you. That's total abstraction. I'm going to concretize that. What I need to do ontologically to concretize that, I first have to see that freedom and necessity are not separated, the way Kant says, that the world is freedom realizing its own necessity, right? And as we've already said, the true individual embodiment of this ultimately necessitated freedom is the state. Hegel. Marx empties the...
Let's just put one more piece of it, because the connection is because of the abstract notion of law that the categorical imperative implies. It's the perfect creation of the agreement of the individual with the general in terms of giving the law.
The moral law. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Isn't that an important part of this, the way that this...
It may be, but let me do this because we can come back to it. Maybe. It may. I just don't know.
Okay.
But what does Marx do? He materializes, he empties out the idea into matter, right? And so he replaces the state with the community of the producers, with the concrete persons, do you see, who are now in this interconnected series, right, of real individuals who are, pardon me, collectible, right? Not in any superficial sense, but all right. And the thinking now occurring then is it's the full incarnation, right, as it were, of this
the collectivity.
The full incarnation of the collectivity or the association is what I called before snipping those bonds of connection, so that the community now is constituted in a perfect freedom. And here's the metaphysical or ontological point, which corresponds with a perfect specification of matter itself in the individual. Do you see what I'm saying? So that there's no matter left over, right? And so I would say analogously, not necessarily exactly the same thing. There's no matter that is not exhausted in each individual or in all of the actually existing individuals. In a certain sense, there's no potentiality that is not actuality, is what is being said here. And I just wanted to put it one other way, if I could recapture it now. It's fleeing me a little bit. So that looking back, one can see, relatively speaking, that what I call the potential intelligibility of the Marxian individuals is potential because those individuals are not yet the full and complete embodiment of matter, because matter itself has not yet been fully and completely rendered intelligible in Marx. Right? It still remains a certain intelligible here being it's not fully in Hegelian terms it's not fully the existing essence, or better way of putting it is that the freedom, and so Marx's goal is freedom. I think we have to say that. And by the way, it was Hegel's ideal, right? Absolute freedom. So it's Marx's goal is the revolution is going to free the revolutionaries from the dregs of history, and it's going to cleanse them. And the ultimate goal of the revolution is a world of freely relating individuals. And so the critique would be that, yes, but the freedom is not complete because of the generic nature of the elements of the community. I have to stop, but that's something like this.
So we're heading towards Ullman, and your flip. I mean, you know,
Okay.
actually, the strangest thing is that I get a feeling that there's an obvious way in which you would turn Ullman,
Okay.
so that what is the appropriation of all men by each, all people, person by each person, becomes the each being at the disposition of the others.
Yes, yes.
That's
Right. Okay.
the next step. That the actual picture is very beautiful in Ullman,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it just needs this one little turn it over,
Right.
and you have your model.
Right. Yes. And I think
You actually do get there.
I think so. At least I intend to do so. We'll see whether I get there, but I think so. Yeah, that's right. That sounds right. And the fact that it's beautiful, it should make you suspicious. It's too ideal. All right. Well,